It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. So now we turn to our health and climate segment of the week, which we usually do on Tuesdays. As it happens, there is so much health and climate news right now. We will probably do a Tuesday, a Wednesday, and a Thursday one this week. If all our guest invitations pan out, we'll be talking about the wildfires tomorrow. Like, can there be a both and solution, like doing more about climate change and changing forest management practices? We hope to talk about that tomorrow. And then on Thursday, the controversial but little covered confirmation hearing for a new Centers for Disease Control director, with, of course, so many public health implications for the country. But for today, it's back to the largest Cyclospora outbreak ever recorded in the United States. The government still says it has now been traced by federal investigators to shredded iceberg lettuce from one supplier, Taylor Farms. It's served at Taco Bell and sold under the market side label at Walmart. The lettuce is under recall now. But we just had a confusing weekend in which the agency flagged a Taylor Farms lettuce sample as positive for the parasite, then walked it back as a false positive. So is it just that one supplier, or is it not? In any case, there have been more than 1,600 confirmed cases since May, with another 5,000 plus still being analyzed. Here in New York, the state health department reports roughly 576 of those cases since May, with a sharp jump in New York City in particular. That's as of last week, July 13th. Officials say so far that our numbers are not a major deviation from the norm. Locally, why is there a norm? And notably, according to the CDC, New York is not one of the 5 states in that Taco Bell cluster. And media reports confirmed by the fact-checking site Snopes say the federal government made surveillance for this exact parasite optional under the Trump administration back in 2025, raising the question of whether we've even lost the ability as a country to catch this thing early. Here to help us sort out what we know and what we don't is Marcia Brown, who covers food and agriculture for Politico and has been reporting on this outbreak as it unfolds. Marcia, thanks so much for some time today. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much, Brian. Great to be on the show.
So what happened this weekend? Walk us through the back and forth. People are confused.
It's so confusing. You're right. I think the first thing I want to say is that this back and forth does not mean that the FDA does not still believe that Taylor Farms is, one of the sources of this outbreak. They have a lot of evidence, epidemiology, a trace back that points to Taylor Farms. So I know there is a lot of confusion, but that's certainly still the case. So what happened with this test is that the FDA, as part of their investigation and their surveillance, is they actually increased surveillance of imported lettuce from Mexico. So they were testing new batches of lettuce. And one of those batches tested positive for Cyclospora. And that was what the FDA was thinking about when they released that. And the reason they did that is because they thought it was important public information that there could be more sources of the outbreak, right? Like a new batch of lettuce. And then they did more testing, and it turned out that was a false positive. And so that created all this confusion about whether Taylor Farms was still, even part of this outbreak.
So is it just Taylor Farms?
The FDA's investigation is ongoing. They have a lot of evidence that points to Taylor Farms for the outbreak in those 5 states that you mentioned, where this lettuce was served in Taco Bell's, select Taco Bell locations. But the FDA has certainly not said that this is, the only source, but this is where their evidence is pointing right now. It's really hard to find Cyclospora. It's one of the more difficult foodborne illnesses to detect when you're trying to trace that down.
So how did investigators land on Taylor Farms and a single farm in central Mexico in the first place?
Yeah, so part of what the FDA does when there's an outbreak like that, they interview people who got
Whoops, I think
This
we lost.
parasite.
Oh, Marcia, we lost
Oh,
you for a second there. You want to start that
oh,
answer again?
sure. Sorry about that. Right. So the FDA, they go to sick people who've been ill and they say, "Do you remember what you ate?" And then they try to find what people ate in common. And a lot of people were eating Taco Bell. What makes this more difficult is that Cyclospora has an incubation period of, roughly a week. So you're asking people to remember a week ago, 2 weeks ago, what they ate. And that becomes really difficult. But the FDA was able to find that Taco Bell in common with, many people eating that. And then they were able to trace that to a single farm in central Mexico that's owned by Taylor Farms. And that is, so they have really strong evidence pointing to that particular farm owned by Taylor Farms. And that's why they're still saying that the recall is ongoing. They're still saying the evidence is pointing to Taylor Farms, even though the investigation is ongoing.
So, listeners, we can take your calls on two tracks here. First, for those of you who were diagnosed with cyclosporiasis, did you ever find out what caused your case or anything you want to report from your experience getting diagnosed? You don't have to tell us, all those other details, but help listeners understand what options for testing were available for you and how you went about it. There may be a few people in the audience feeling sick and wondering what your options are right now and if this is what you have. So listeners, help those people out if you have been through this. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. And for any of you out there tracking the Taylor Farms and FDA back and forth, just following the news, or if you work in the food industry, how about you? Restaurant owners, help us out here. Chefs, servers, maybe Taco Bell or Walmart employees listening right now. How are you or your employers dealing with the outbreak? Did you pull any items off of the menu for the time being? Do you notice customers being extra cautious or anything you want to share from the business or political side of this story? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text from Marcia Brown from Politico. Marcia, I cited some numbers in the intro, but how big is this outbreak compared to a normal year? And why do we even have to talk about a normal year anyway? Why isn't something like this entirely preventable?
That's a great question, Brian. So first on the numbers, the CDC has confirmed more than 1,600 cases. Those are lab confirmations, and I'm sure your listeners have certainly heard about thousands of cases. We're seeing states like Michigan reporting, I believe, more than 6,000 cases. And so, the CDC is aware of that. They are then looking into each of those cases and updating their numbers. We've seen over 100 hospitalizations and thankfully no deaths. But this is a huge outbreak. You're absolutely right. This is way more than what we would see in a typical year. It's up from, I think a typical year is just a couple hundred, and now we're really in the thousands. So that's a really big difference. The reason this is seasonal is because people eat a lot more fresh produce in the summertime, and that kind of produce, berries, they might not be cooking that, herbs, they might not be cooking that, and cooking is what kills this parasite.
Listener writes, can you please cover the origins of the parasite? What are the farm practices that cause it?
So there are a few challenges with this. It can be caused by contaminated water. And it's really hard to know if you're a farmer necessarily if the water you're using is contaminated, right? There might be a source of contamination like miles upriver from you. You also might have a farm that's near an animal, a livestock operation, and then you have maybe some runoff. And that's certainly what we've seen in other foodborne pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli. I'm sure that your listeners have heard about, fresh produce having E. coli. And so sometimes that's how that happens. And it can be really difficult for farmers to prevent this and be aware of this. There's a lot of public health experts that are doing research and trying to figure out best practices to ensure that, you're not having runoff into those fields of lettuce, the kinds of produce that people are not cooking.
Listener writes, I'm a New Yorker and I had Cyclospora about 3 weeks ago, and I've never eaten at Taco Bell. And I mentioned in the intro that the New York Taco Bells are not believed to be in this cluster. So why would there be hundreds of cases in New York right now if it's not related to Taylor Farms? Or is it?
Yeah, so what we're seeing right now is the FDA is saying they're investigating multiple what they call subclusters, and some of those investigations are ongoing. So New York is not part of the 5 states that we talked about at the top of this segment, and there hasn't really been anything from regulators about what exactly the source might be. There is an ongoing lettuce recall in New York. And so, some of this lettuce that we're talking about was sold under brand names. It wasn't necessarily coming through Taco Bell. And so but it is hard to know. I mean, like I was saying, when I talk to public health experts, it's really hard to test this. There have been cyclospora outbreaks in the past where they never found a culprit. This is just the science is not quite where it is for bacteria and other foodborne pathogens. And so that just makes it harder for public health officials and experts to kind of.
Listener writes,
I'm really hoping that the FDA and yeah.
No, go ahead. Finish that thought. Sorry. Thought you were done.
Sorry. I was just saying that I'm hoping the FDA comes up with, find some source very soon, because I think there's a lot of confusion and fear and anxiety around this.
Listener writes, can farms test their produce before shipping?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
The question is, can farms test their produce before shipping?
Yeah, so there could be some processors, especially like larger scale produce operations, that can do some of this. But I think it's harder for smaller operations. But we also tend not to see cyclospora outbreaks linked to smaller farms. But yes, there are options. There's something called a food traceability rule, which was part of legislation passed actually a decade ago. But the rule has never been finalized. And what that is supposed to do is allow federal regulators to trace, products that are sold at the grocery store all the way back to where they were grown, because they often, they go through processors and then they're going through logistics. And so having that traceability would make it easier for investigators to find this source.
Stacy in Queens, you're on WNYC with Marcia Brown from Politico, covering the Cyclospora outbreak. Hi, Stacy.
Hi, nice to be talking to you. First-time caller, long-time listener. Quick question. The Taylor Farms prepackaged salads, are they part of this issue? I read in one article they were not, but I'm a little bit concerned about that.
Yes. So I don't believe that the recall right now includes market side brand iceberg products that are sold at Walmart. And I'm looking at this right now, in certain states. And then there's also Taco Bell locations that we talked about earlier. The recall also includes iceberg products that are being recalled, in I believe like 20 plus other states. So I'm not seeing that as part of the recall, but the full recall is available on the Taylor Farms website.
Hopefully that's enough for you to get your question answered, Stacey. And Taylor Farms, we should say, is not a niche supplier, right? According to Snopes, for example, Taylor Farms makes 2 out of every 5 ready-to-eat salads in the United States. And you report that Taylor Farms says the FDA apologized for the false positive, but the FDA pushed back. saying it only gave the company factual information. What do you make of that dispute?
Yes, I thought that was really interesting. So, over the weekend when the FDA said they had a false positive, we then saw a statement from Taylor Farms where they said, I believe it was like today, the FDA apologized to us. And that statement is still up on their website. And we asked the FDA about that, and they pushed back and said that, the FDA only provided factual information. They did not apologize. But I do think that that statement kind of muddies the waters and it's confusing to consumers. I think a lot of people are wondering, well, okay, there's this false positive. Taylor Farms is saying that they apologized to us. So are they even still part of the outbreak? And like I said at the top, they are still part of the outbreak. The evidence that the FDA has right now is still pointing to Taylor Farms iceberg lettuce products. So I think that that's important for listeners to keep in mind.
And Snopes confirmed media reporting from last year, the first year of the Trump administration, that said the CDC made cyclospora surveillance optional. So how much can we responsibly say about whether those changes affected the response or the extent of the outbreak this year?
Yeah, a lot of people are wondering about this. Cyclospora outbreaks happen in every administration. So it's hard to, draw conclusions that like because these decisions were made, therefore this outbreak happened. But I think a lot of people are pointing to, staffing cuts at the FDA and the CDC and ending certain task forces that advised industry about food safety practices. And you mentioned the surveillance. I mean, all of this, I think a lot of people are looking at and saying, well, is that making this outbreak worse? Or is it making, the FDA slower to respond? And I think, these are all questions that we are asking and we're reporting out. Again, it's hard to draw conclusions, but I think what's happening right now does open up the FDA to those critiques.
We're getting a few texts like this. I've read that Taylor Farms donated $1 million to MAGA PAC after traceability was removed by Trump administration. Is this true? Also, did the backtrack come after Taylor Farms met with FDA and White House officials?
Yeah, so this is a great question. We've been seeing this also online. Taylor Farms has made some political donations prior to this outbreak. And I do want to emphasize that a lot of companies make donations, but certainly I think this is raising questions among consumers. And people really are wondering, like, is the company, getting special treatment? And I think one thing to keep in mind is when outbreaks like this happen, they are bad for business. I mean, it can deter consumers from a brand for years, for a decade. I talked to, a trade association that represents produce growers, and they said they're already seeing canceled orders from grocery stores and retailers because they're anticipating that consumers are not going to be buying as much fresh produce, I should say. And so we're certainly seeing the ripple effect from this, all over.
People are still confused. Even after our conversation or after most of our conversation, which has taken place, we have a text just now that says, sorry, can you confirm it's only been iceberg lettuce so far? And another one that says, this is a New York-based radio station, and you've just told us that the wing of Taco Bell in New York is not responsible for the outbreak. Yet, people in New York are still getting sick. What other than Taylor Farms is being looked into that would give New Yorkers an answer to why the outbreak is occurring here? How specifically, and we did touch on this before, but let's revisit it. How specifically can you answer that last listener's question?
Yeah, so I think, again, I do want to emphasize Taylor Farms is part of this outbreak, the back and forth change, the fact that evidence pointing to Taylor Farms as, one of the sources of this outbreak. The investigation is ongoing. They are investigating multiple, what they're calling subclusters, and they're trying to figure out like what the source of this is. As I said earlier, investigators to find this, there's a line between when people eat the contaminated food and when they actually get sick. And that makes it much harder for investigators talking to patients, trying to figure out what they ate. I think that this delay from the FDA in finding a source, even if it is a hard investigation, a difficult investigation, it does create a lot of uncertainty. It creates a lot of anxiety. I think people are confused, and that's why we're seeing all this discussion about Taylor Farms and like their political donations. I think it's really hard right now if you're a consumer and you're trying to figure out like what is the safe fresh produce that I can eat, and what salad products are safe, and all of that.
And so to the other listener's question about whether it's really just iceberg lettuce, we have yet another one that says the original announcement included leafy greens, fresh fruits, and vegetables, and now conveniently, with some skepticism there, obviously, conveniently, it all boils down to one single manufacturer of a single product. What gives?
Yeah, so that earlier recommendation is really based on previous Cyclospora outbreaks. So I think I said this earlier in the call. Cyclospora is often found on fresh produce. Historically, we've seen outbreaks linked to lettuce, linked to herbs, linked to berries. And so I think that's probably where a lot of those recommendations were coming from. Now that the FDA has both traceback as a piece of evidence, that central Mexico, that farm in central Mexico, and then also the interviews with sick patients, they've really been able to narrow in on this lettuce as a vector for this. The current recall right now on the FDA is they're recommending that consumers, restaurants, and retailers, not to use Taylor Fresh Foods iceberg lettuce. It's recommending not eating lettuce at any Taco Bell locations. And if you don't know the source of the lettuce, like if you're eating at a restaurant, you should not eat it, or you should ask the restaurant. And if they can't tell you, probably don't eat that lettuce.
And what about from the supermarket? Because here's a text that says, key food manager and cashier did not know where their salad items, particularly lettuce, were sourced from. No signs posted in the lettuce section.
That's really one of the challenges here, is that you might have retailers that don't know the source of their lettuce. Taylor Farms, is a huge distributor. We're talking about, we already mentioned that there are some market side brand iceberg lettuce products sold at Walmart that are part of the recall. And of course, market side brand is not Taylor Farms brand. So that's also confusing. Consumers might not know that it's, this another label, that it's sold under another label. I realize that it is really difficult as a consumer to figure out right now what is safe.
And one last call that also touches on politics. Laura in Newton, New Jersey, you're on WNYC. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I just wondered if it was considered whether the immigration detainments have had a bearing on the farm workers, and whether that's has affected the lack of quality of service on the farms.
Yeah, Marcia, you have anything on that? And we should say, and this is accurate, right, that it's the farm workers who are probably at the most risk of contamination as they work in the fields?
I actually can't comment on who is at most risk. I know that when you consume this lettuce, that is how the parasite enters your body. I don't know. I haven't seen any reporting, and I have not done any reporting linking, immigrants in detention to this outbreak. So I can't say any more on that.
Well, there, I guess we'll leave it for now on this. I guess maybe just to finish up with one more little bit of advice. If a listener has a bag of shredded lettuce in their fridge right now, what does the current guidance from the CDC or the FDA actually tell them to do?
So if you have that bag of lettuce, you should check and see what is the brand on that lettuce. You should check and see, whether it's a certain size. The recall is specific, or 12 ounce, 24 ounce, and look at the best if used by dates. And then you should check on the FDA website if that lettuce is part of this current recall. The thing about lettuce, it does have a short shelf life. So a lot, we're talking about lettuce that, some of that lettuce was sold a while ago, but some of it is, the FDA is still investigating. This outbreak is ongoing. There could be additional sources. So certainly check the brand, check the amounts and the best if used by dates, and see if that's what's on the FDA website.
Marcia Brown, food and agriculture reporter for Politico. Thanks so much for coming on today and explaining as much as you can in this confusing situation, which unfortunately is still confusing for many Americans.
Yes, it certainly is. Thanks, Brian. It's great to talk with your listeners, and I hope it helps clear some things up. We'll certainly be, continuing to ask questions and looking into this. So appreciate the time.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.